Alright, so our subject is non-lethal weapons, and it's by Amy Kaufman, me, Olivia Link, and then Kenzie Huffman. Our outline is first, we are going to talk about what a non-lethal weapon is and their different types. Second, we're going to talk about cruel weapons versus non-lethal weapons. Third, we're going to talk about the Moscow theater hostage situation. Fourth, we're going to talk about Gross versus Justin Bellow. And then we're going to explain our opinion on the subject, and then we'll take any questions down in the comments.
Okay, so a non-lethal weapon, as described by the Department of Defense of the United States, is that it incapacitates a person immediately and it minimizes fatalities and does not create permanent injuries. And it's intended to have a reversible effect. The Department of Defense actually has a program for non-lethal weapons, so I thought that was very interesting. So non-lethal weapons are the difference between shooting and shouting, which means that if a situation escalates, it's one more level of like interjection before, like, you know, the ultimate consequence, which is death. So it's supposed to help in situations that are very complex, such as like crowd management, convoy operations, checkpoint security, things where civilians might be involved or where you might need to try to detain a person rather than to kill them. The different types of lethal weapons. There is biological, there's optical, there are acoustical, chemical, electromagnetic, and neurological. Then one of the most common uses of non-lethal weapons is the gases, as well as the acoustical, which is audible or infrared sounds. And so a lot of these are meant to just stun a person or create non-lasting harm or to incapacitate someone without permanent injury. So on the right-hand side of our slide are different types of weapons that the US is currently using, actually. So on the bottom right-hand, you can see that there's a flashbang, which just creates a big flash of light to momentarily stun a person, as well as in the upper left-hand corner, there's the ocular interrupter, which is supposed to help interrupt like signals. So yeah. So according to the Geneva Convention, Article 35, it says that parties to a conflict and members of their armed forces do not have an unlimited choice of method and means, which means that some types of methods and warfares are too damaging and too unnecessary to suffering that they're just prohibited, such as lances with spears with barbed heads. So when it's like injected in the body, it creates unnecessary harm because the barbs aren't needed. Additionally, poisons and poison weapons, and projectiles smeared with substances that inflame wounds. So just things that are too cruel in order to like use in everyday warfare or warfare that causes unneeded suffering. And some non-lethal weapons might actually fall into this category. So let's take an example.
So, in 2002, October, the Chechen rebels invaded Moscow theater and kept 800 people hostage for 57 hours. The Russian troops released a gas as like a non-lethal weapon meant to incapacitate the rebels. However, the gas killed more than 120 hostages in this. However, Russian officials refused to disclose what the mysterious gas was made of. So later, physicians, while treating the patients, had no idea how to stop them from getting worse or continuing to die. They finally figured out what the gas contained. It contained carfentanil. It's an opioid that's 10,000 times more powerful than morphine. However, by the time the doctors discovered how to treat the patients, many cases had worsened or some even died. And then this can be an example of how a non-lethal weapon, quote, can actually be more destructive than helping, like, than actually using like firearms, and that actually resulted in more casualties.
So, Gross argues for the use of non-lethal weapons. In his view, killing civilians is always morally wrong, and it is also against international law. However, sometimes it is nearly impossible to distinguish between civilians and combatants. And in those cases, civilians are at risk no matter what. His view is that non-lethal weapons can help spare civilian lives by deterring civilians and overcoming militant crowds. He also says that there's a distinction between law enforcement and international warfare, and while the use of non-lethal weapons is not prohibited in law enforcement, it is in international warfare. His view is that, again, it's a lesser evil, so his response to the idea that it causes unnecessary suffering is that it is better to cause short-term incapacitation and irritation rather than to kill or have long-term injury.
Justin Bellow, we have a lot of different philosophers that make up what is known as just war theory, the most prominent being Michael Walzer. And so there's two different principles which make up Justin Bellow, and that's the principle of discrimination and the principle of proportionality. So the principle of discrimination says that civilians have not forfeited any of their rights, such as to hurt or to be hurt by military forces or law enforcement. But it is seen that in times of war, they can be seen as collateral damage. And that is when the unnecessary things happen. When they become casualties of war, but it seemed that it was inevitable, or they couldn't have gotten to their cause. They couldn't have achieved their goals if not for these collateral damages. But then there's also the doctrine of double effect, which says that civilian casualties are justifiable so long as their deaths are not intended and they are merely accidental. So such as you can't bomb a town and then say that that's just, but if you bomb a munitions warehouse, the people who are there, even if they're civilians, they're bombing the warehouse because it has munitions and army stuff, and they were just collateral damage, and that's why it's justified. But the principle of proportionality says that the damage done must be proportional to the objective desired. So you can't, the lives you had put at stake, or the lives you had killed in this, the unintended consequences must be proportional to the objective. So you can't, just the damage can't outweigh the cost, essentially. And that minimum force is necessary, and that you should do everything you can to keep casualties low, and that your force should be kept low as well. And that this is only limited to war. It does not consider other types of war, such as law enforcement or public civilian war. And it says that weapons that do not discriminate cannot be used, such as gassing a person or starving a person, or using anything that is indiscriminate for the person who is having effect. The bottom line is that non-lethal weapons that do not discriminate against combatants and non-combatants are not morally permissible. However, it can be said as a counterpoint that non-lethal weapons can be used outside the scope of traditional war and may be more useful than lethal weapons.
I guess we'll talk about if Russia was justified or not in its use of non-lethal weapons against the rebels. Gross would say yes, because in the case such as the Moscow theater incident, it would be difficult to distinguish between the hostages and the rebels, and either way we would be putting the hostages at risk of injury or death. So it would be better to temporarily incapacitate rather than to accidentally kill through open fire.
Justin Bellow says no, because through their lens of a limited war scope, they say that one must use limited quality and quantity of weapons, and so using gas or asphyxiation, which does not discriminate, is morally wrong. And although what happened in Russia was with the law enforcement, the fact that it had so many detrimental effects, I think looking back on it post this, they were unjustified in using it with Justin Bellow because the damage outweighed the actual cost.
Our view of it is a utilitarian approach, which is meaning we look at the consequences of what could happen. So with that, we agree with Gross's lesser evil assumption, because we feel that non-lethal weapons more often than not leaves less casualties and less harm on the victims and the property. And then if a loss of life can be prevented, then it morally is a superior option.
And then these were our sources.